What's good? Today's video is going to cover what a duel for spot is and the common laws of it. Now, this is something I think is important to cover and teach new players who haven't been told what it is or how it works and the rules of it. Because this game has been out for a while, there's a lot of information and things are set in stone and oftentimes don't get passed down easily to newer players. In this case, the duel for spot oftentimes is misinformed or just not informed at all to some people. So let's start off with the basics. Duel for spot is always going to be the official term used to describe this specific law, and you'll often see it known as the acronym form of DFS, which is of course means duel for spot. Some people might just ask to duel and it essentially refers to the same thing. Now let's talk about where the specific rule or law takes place. Any grind spot that has a solid or concrete rotation with trash loot to give per hour is where duel for spot can occur. This means that the moment you enter any grind spot rotation, that place will follow the laws of duel for spot for everyone there. This also happens for life skillers when doing Fox or cow rotations, but I'm no life skilling expert myself, so that's a trickier topic to tackle. So places like Polly's Forest, Sawson's Garrison, Mirmak Ruins, Gahaz, Histria, Star's End, Bloodwolf, Tauros, you name it. As I said, a fuck ton of grind spots exist everywhere in this game, so pretty much 99% of the spots you go to will follow these laws. Things only get tricky when dealing with solo grind rotation and group grind rotation. For now, let's talk about these solo grind rotation scenarios. Now, these rules aren't really set in a document anywhere or anything that's official, but it's more or less the player's base version of the gentleman's agreement. So I pretty much have to pretend this is written somewhere in like BDO's constitution. I don't know, just go with it. So the laws of duel for spot states that any player who starts grinding at a rotation is susceptible to any player who may have the right to challenge them for that spot using duel for spot's law. If a duel for spot is ignored or declined, the player has the right to take action and kill said player who declined/ignored through any means. This does not condone excessive overkill, griefing, nor the intentional act of feeding said player to mobs. When a duel for spot is mutually agreed amongst two players, they can now proceed to play out a best out of 3. Z buff, E buff, or even class buff are not allowed and is considered an act of cheese. 100% Black Spirit's Rage are not as allowed as well. If a player activates any of the following, the opposing player has the right to match the buffs they used and activated for themselves as well. The player who wins the best out of 3 gets to stay in the grind rotation. Now, after years of playing this game, I can safely say these are some pretty concrete rules that have been consistent throughout most people's experiences in duel for spots. I didn't create the rules or anything, but from what I've seen, heard, and experienced, this would be the closest to the ground rules and general consensus of duel for spots. There's definitely a lot more to it. I'm going to tackle each topic and scenario one by one so you have an absolute understanding of how it all works. So first things first, when you enter a grind rotation, your first priority will be searching. Typically, if you understand the grind rotation, you know where to look to see if someone will be at the spot you want to grind in. The best way to make sure you didn't start grinding while someone else was already there is checking the entire rotation to make sure no one else is around. If the rotation is clear, it is free for the taking. Otherwise, in this case, if you find someone at the rotation, all you have to do is walk up to them and ask for a duel for spot or DFS. Then usually they are cool with it, and usually at high density spots or higher end spots, people will prefer to fight on the road or somewhere more open and safe. Then after you guys pull up to the side, you can then go up to them and challenge them to a duel. Now before the duel for spot happens, I'd recommend having your health and mana pots on if you have a fairy, and to buy some if you needed from your tent. Otherwise, you can use your marketplace made to buy or collect your pots that way. That's what most people do before a duel for spot, is ringing up their maids or tent to get the pots and buffs they need. Then usually before they fight, one of the players might ask or confirm if it's a BO3, which means best of 3. Whoever wins 2 out of 3, of course. Then after they agree to it, they can then type R in the chat when they are ready. Once both players have already typed R, they can start. Whoever wins the first round has to step back and wait for the opponent to get up and get ready. Then the process repeats itself, and they both type R again and continue. Then after the best of 3 ends, the player who won gets to keep the spot and continues grinding there. And usually out of kind gesture, both players will type GFS after they finish. GFS meaning good fights, usually good sportsmanship. Then the person who lost usually has to switch servers and find an open spot somewhere else. That is pretty much the summary and example of how duel for spots go, especially if everyone follows the law correctly and communicates properly. Now let's go into the other scenarios you should watch out for during your duel. It's the argument of Z buff, E buff, class buff, or even 100% Black Spirit Rage. Now a grand majority of the player base knows not to use these to their advantage and simply just fight using anything else but those. The big reason why is because it's very easy for someone to gear check, or perhaps an unskilled player to cheese their victory on cheap kills in their duel. Certain classes have gimmicks that benefit from certain buffs, or certain classes with very powerful 100% Blackspirit Rage abilities and can sometimes one-shot or win them the round heavily. Not every class has very good 100% Rage, so sometimes it's not entirely fair. And on top of that, class buffs aren't necessary to use either, unless you're super undergeared compared to the person you are fighting. Same goes with Z buff. The idea of a duel for spot is to have the right to use the PvP combat system in this game to settle disputes and decisions to make conflict more productive. In this case, it can settle out who gets to grind at a spot. Obviously, people have different gear in classes, so that means there will be unfair fights between gear and matchups, which is why adding in more variables like class buff and 100% rage will make things even more messy than it needs to be. I will say this as a statement that many people will agree with. Skilled players do not need to rely on or use Z buff, class buff, or 100% rage to win a 1v1. It's the same logic behind 1v1s in the battle arena. Everyone knows that when people 1v1 in the BA, rarely do people use their Z buff, class buff, or 100% rage. Those abilities are unskillful ways of getting an edge on your opponent. In other words, they're not hard to use at all. People like to test their skill without using those cheese options so they can better hone their skills and not to rely on them, which is why it translates to 1v1s in a duel for spot. Even though some people would say they don't give a fuck and they would rather go all out to defend and keep their spot, it's a valid point to a certain degree, but it also shows that he wouldn't have won the spot otherwise and had to rely on cheese, which could also cause the other person to get upset that they got cheesed and might just say, fuck the duel for spot, I'm going to flag up and grief you, or possibly hunt you down. Things could get messy once you involve certain things into a duel for spot that most people don't like, which is why it's best to avoid that shit by not using any of those buffs in the first place. If you win the spot fair and square, that's that. So in the event that you're dueling someone round 1 and that person right before both of you say R, he sneaks in a Z buff to get an edge, do not try to type or try to call out that person after you guys say R. Otherwise, this will happen. Now, this happens a few times to certain people, unfortunately, but the last thing you'd want to do is type during a duel after you guys say R. Two big reasons why you shouldn't do that is that after both players type R, the fight is technically already started, and the person who snuck a Z buff will definitely charge straight at you and kill you. Chances are, if he's Z buffed real quick before the fight, that person clearly doesn't care to argue, nor give a fuck if you die while typing. In fact, that person might argue that that round actually counted. Then both players will probably start to argue. Then before you know it, it turns out to be a big mess. So to prepare yourself if that happens, make sure to pay attention to your opponent at the beginning. If you're quick enough, you just might have enough time to Z buff right after he does. Then you could type R. That way both of you Z buffed, it's fair that way. Of course, sometimes they might even Z buff during the fight, in which case you might as well Z buff too. The idea is to match whatever bullshit they happen to pull so that you can even it out. Otherwise, if you're not quick enough, you pretty much forced to fight it out after they quickly Z buffed and R'd up. After all, you don't want to lose that round, so you might as well play it out. And since that person Z buffed, you technically have two options after. Either you don't Z buff to show that you don't need it, or you can Z buff the next round since they did that to you the first one. If they complain or mention it, simply throw it back at them and be like, yo, bitch, you fucking used it on me first. Lots of people will argue that there is no concrete rule against any buff during the duel for spot, or that it's a game and it doesn't matter. Therefore, they will do whatever they want. But realistically, it's that mentality or mindset that ends up getting other people or guilds involved and ends up turning into a war. Most people don't accept that excuse or logic, so unless that person is nice enough to shrug it off and go to the next server, you're probably going to get a GVG happening soon. I'll cover the war and GVG cause and effect in duel for spots later in the video. So outside of that, that covers the duel aspect and what could happen. There's of course other scenarios that could happen, but most of the time people duel for spot normally and don't do anything stupid. Outside of the buffs, you should be fine and hopefully you win the best of 3. Now let's go over what happens when you ask for a duel for spot and they completely ignore you. Now there's going to be two reasons that might happen. One is that, yeah, they might actually have their general chat turned off. This can happen randomly when people log in sometimes and their UIs get fucked and their basic general chat could be checked off, or they have a different chat window up that only shows a specific chat. But the issue is, even if that's true, they should be able to see an actual person standing in front of them while grinding, asking them a question. And that will go into the second explanation. We all know that people who grind tend to watch something very often on their second monitor, whether it's a movie or YouTube. They're probably not paying attention half the time, but even still, the rule is if you ask for a duel for spot a few times and they continue on to ignore and grind, you pretty much have the right to kill them. My golden rule is I tend to ask them twice and give them a bit of time in between so they can most definitely see me. And if they don't respond after I ask them twice, I generally kill them. To kill them, you have to press Alt and C to enable PvP mode. This way you can freely kill them and you'll only lose karma in the process. Like I said, no one can really dodge the duel for spot system, so if someone declines or ignores it, they're not safe. You pretty much have the right to kill them, and a grand majority of people would agree. It's a lot better and civil to just ask for a duel for spot rather than coming out of nowhere and killing them without saying anything. And if they don't respond, well, that's just that. Of course, there are scenarios where they actually see you and even stop for a second, but then continue to grind. At this point, there's no defending them. They either don't know the duel for spot exists or that they don't care and just want to grind. Either way, nothing changes. You would also have the right to kill them here as well. You might even come across some players that will try to give you a summary of their buffs or scrolls, or that they just swap servers so they can continue to grind. Unless you're a super nice person and can see, oh well shit, I don't want to mess with their scrolls, I'll just swap. That's okay and honestly a nice thing to do, but at the same time you have to understand that everyone who grinds probably runs all the scrolls they can do, and maybe just swap servers as well, so that person isn't special and is just trying his best not to duel for spot or even lose a spot. In this case, if you can keep denying the duel for spot, you pretty much have no other choice but to kill him as well. Those are all the possible scenarios that can happen to you if you try to grind out at a spot and they deny, ignore, or try to persuade you out of taking their spot. None of that really saves them in a good argument. Either they accept the duel for spot or they die. That's it. Now, there are limits and rules against what you can and can't do. Once again, the duel for spot does not condone excessive killing or feeding mobs. So if you decide to kill your target because of the previous reason, kill them clean and make sure to finish them off. Do not any under circumstances feed your targets to mobs. It's just a dick thing to do and will immediately make you the bad guy. And when people find out you did that, you'll definitely start a GVG because of it. There are definitely ways to intentionally feed your targets to mobs, which is CCing them purposely in front of groups while standing there watching. This is the most common and blatant form of intentional feeding. They will constantly CC you so other mobs can aggro on top and kill that person. This is a big no-no and something that no one should do regardless. Sometimes people do get unlucky and in between PvP someone CCs and deals massive amounts of damage, but then a nearby mob ends up taking the kill. That's up to the interpretation if it was feeding or not, because smart griefers know to intentionally play out a PvP scenario but then wait till the last second when they're low to CC them in front of mobs and get them killed, and they'll pretend it wasn't on purpose and it was unfortunate even though they know damn well it was all planned. Otherwise, do not feed people to mobs. Another thing not to do would be to grind over them or even counter grind at the same spot. This would be considered griefing and does not really help either player, so you're really just wasting your time. At this point, you might as well just deck on their guild and kill them, or kill them straight up if they do not duel for spot. Defeats the purpose of it all if you just grind with him. So this is an obvious no-no and you should never grind over them if you can help it. Then of course, another scenario is you're just grinding peacefully and someone comes out of nowhere and without saying anything, they flag up and kill you. If this happens to you, no need to duel for spot. You can honestly just kill him to get your spot back. Last scenario would be the karma bomb situation. Now, let me explain to you why it's called a karma bomb. Karma is a system in this game that was originally designed to have a limit on how much a person can kill someone else excessively through Alt-C, which is a forced PvP mode. If this person were to turn on forced PvP mode and they can kill someone else, they will lose karma based on that person's gear score. The highest positive karma you start out with is 300,000 and the lowest you can get is negative 1 million karma. So the exact numbers always fluctuate depending on the person you kill. So let's just say if you were to kill someone who is decently geared, and you might be decently geared, you might lose anywhere from 20,000 to 60,000k, maybe even less than 20k karma. It all could be way more or way less depending on your definition of decently geared. Then of course, if you kill someone who is heavily under geared, you could lose anywhere from 100k to maybe even 180k. I've heard people lose 250k before, because the higher gear you are and the lesser gear they are, the more you lose. And the reason why it's called a karma bomb is because people will intentionally take off all of their gear and run at you just to get killed. And once you've killed them in one shot just like that, they lose a huge amounts of karma. It literally bombs your karma heavily, and typically karma bombers do this multiple amounts of times until the target goes red. The reason why this works is because there is no indication or notification of you losing karma at all. You have to manually check your karma on your profile tab. Otherwise, most people won't even consider nor remember about the karma system and will unconsciously kill them over and over again. If you go into the negative karma, your name will appear as red and you will now have penalties, which is why we nickname people red players, or that person has gone red. That means now because they are in the negative karma, if they enter any city, the guards there will attack and kill you. Their names will appear purple, I believe, and they will have very strong stats, enough to scare you off from entering cities to begin with. And because you are also red, that means any player can kill you anywhere, even in the safe zones. So nowhere is safe if you're red. And the big penalty of it all is that every time you die, if you're red, you lose crystals. They essentially break. If you have no crystals while you're red, if you die, you actually end up losing the enhancement level of any gear by 1. That means if you're red and you die without crystals, you have a chance for your pen dandy to go down to a tet, just like that, or even your tet accessory to go down to try, each death at a time. So none of your gear is safe when you have no crystals left. It's an ultimate punishment for anyone who doesn't keep the karma system in mind. And what happens when you're red, you have to grind out at Pilaku to help gain your karma back, which is way out in the furthest spot in BDO possible. Only other spot would be Manchas and Calfian that I can think of, and that's it. Put some more spots in the comments down below for some of you guys that can think of other spots. So if that wasn't already a good warning for you guys not to go red, I don't know what will. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but what happens if you find yourself in a group grind situation? For example, you and your guildmates are grinding over at Mirmak Ruins, aka trees, and a group of people come along to your rotation. What happens then? Well, there's only 2 possible scenarios that can happen in a civil manner. One is that both groups will pick a champion to 1v1 for the spot. And of course, it will be a best out of 3 to decide who gets it. Or they could agree to a 3v3 and a best out of 3 to decide who keeps it. Both options are viable and can work to settle the winner. Otherwise, most people would rather get their friend groups and just outright flag up and kill them on the spot. So if you ever grind in a group, remember that this can happen and most people do not care about duel for spots when it comes to group spots. So in that case, you just might have to take your spot back or ask for backup from your guild. Which transitions into our next topic. Let's add in the variables of decks, war, GVG, and guilds. So if you've been playing this game for a while, you might have stumbled upon a guild you've joined and maybe have or have not sent a deck or requested a deck on a guild. A deck is a short term for declaration, which is also short for declaration of war. A declaration of war can be made from the guild master or officer, who can place the name of the guild they want to declare war on. By doing so, the opposing guild will see that they have been sent a deck on them. They can also choose to ignore it, or if they choose to mutually agree to it, they will send a deck back to them, which means both guilds have decked each other, and after 15 minutes, both guilds will become at war, which means they can freely kill each other on site with no penalties or karma loss. That means if you were to get your spot taken from you or griefed by someone, you can ask your guild mates to send a deck to that person, and 15 minutes has passed for both guilds. Then you guys can kill each other as much as you want, and it becomes a king of the hill situation. So this adds another scenario for duel for spots. If someone ignores your duel for spot, you can kill them and they keep coming back. Most of the time people will deck on their guild so they can keep killing them without karma loss, and there is a high chance that the other person will call in their guildies to help retake the spot, because he most likely told them a story that favored him. And before you know it, both guilds bring in numerous people to fight over the nearest node, being told by both members who probably said, "This guy griefed my spot," which then later turns into a guild politics with both members arguing about who said what and who's lying. So if you really want all of that to happen, you could say fuck it and bring your guild members into it, or you can avoid the entire GVG and just swap servers. Just know that decking on a guild to avoid karma loss is convenient and the easiest way to settle the king of the hill at a grind spot. It also alarms the guild and potentially starts a war. And that wraps up the law of duel for spot, how it works and the idea of it, and even some of the scenarios you might find yourself in. Hopefully you guys now understand the construct of duel for spot and might find this useful for you guys out there finding a spot to grind in. And as always, if you guys have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next vid. Peace.